Welcome back to the Collectability Podcast. Today, we are pleased and honored to welcome my dear friend and mentor, Daryn Schnipper. This is the podcast that I've been waiting for and many of our listeners have been waiting for. But let's start first with the official bio. Daryn Schnipper joined Sotheby's in 1980. In her current role as chairman of the International Watch Division, she builds on her extensive client relationships worldwide to promote Sotheby's international watch business. Early in her career, and we're going to dig into this very shortly, Daryn became a pioneer of wristwatches as a new collecting category and the first dedicated wristwatch auctions. Under her leadership, watch sales expanded in Geneva, and in 1997, she opened Sotheby's first Asian department in Hong Kong. And we're going to have to talk about Arthur soon, too. We have so many people to discuss, Daryn. Daryn has played a pivotal role in the sale of numerous important single-owner watch and clock collections. These include, of course, the masterpieces from the Time Museum, a single-owner horological collection that sold world record after world record. In 1999, the masterpieces from the Time Museum sale included the legendary Patek Philippe Graves Supercomplication, which hammered for $11 million, a world record for any timepiece at auction, against a pre-sale estimate of $3 to $5 million. Of course, records have been broken since then, and many more records will be broken in the future, and that's another topic which we're going to be discussing shortly. Daryn's achievements include the George Daniels Horological Collection in 2012, which sold for almost $14 million. Pieces from the collection of the late Reginald Fullerton and his grandfather, Henry Graves Jr. We're going to discuss that shortly. And other notable sales include watches from the estate of Andy Warhol, and of course, the Justice Shepro collection of clocks. And we can't forget the collection of Esmond Bradley Martin in 2002. Daryn was made a Liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in 2017, which is the oldest horological guild in the world. And wow, now I think I have to bring up the unofficial bio. Daryn, you were my first boss. You were the person that opened the door to my professional career in watches. And I want to kick things off with just a big thank you.
Oh, that is so sweet.
You are a mentor to me, an industry pioneer, a trendsetter, a world-class expert, and you are the hardest working person in the industry. So I just want to thank you. And with those words, welcome to Collectability.
Wow. Well, John, I just want to thank you for having me today. I mean, I was really looking forward to this.
It's been, since the first time we thought of having Collectability podcast, been waiting for this moment. So here we are. I'm going to ask all the questions that we wanted to know about your career, where the market is and where the market's going, because the insight that you offer as the ultimate insider, I think, is the bottom line. So let's get started. Daryn, how did your horological career begin?
Well, funny you should ask that. I figured that would be your first question. I was all set to be a journalist. I was at Boston University studying journalism, and I became friendly with this fellow whose father, he kept telling me about, was a watch dealer at the time. And he told me that his father would travel all over the world and, buy watches. And I thought, wow, well, what kind of watches does he buy? Well, anyway, fast forward, I met the father, Abe Sokovsky, and he was amazing. He was the person that set me on my path. I worked for him for 2 summers, researching a book on King Farouk, whose fabulous collection Sotheby sold in 1954 after Farouk had been kicked out of the country. And that research as a journalism major, because I was still in college, the research that I did brought me to Sotheby's. And Abe Sokovsky was quite friendly with Kevin Tierney, who was in charge of selling watches in addition to silver, miniatures, objects of virtue, you name it. It was a multifaceted department, as they say. And I was introduced to Sotheby's through Abe. And when I was there doing my research on where are they now, which was about finding if Farouk watches had come up again and how much they sold for compared to what they sold for in 1954. And I took one look around, and I was there for a few days, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. The only thing I really knew about Sotheby's at that point, other than the fact that it was an auction house, was that Caroline Kennedy had gone to the Sotheby's Institute. And I figured, well, this is a really cool place. So I graduated from college, and I was hired to be a cataloger of watches right out of school.
That's incredible. And this is 1980.
Yes, June of 1980.
Now, did Abe Sikofsky, who, may he rest in peace.
Yes.
I mean, it's just, you introduced me to him, and I think he passed away, it was 1998.
Yeah.
So it's just as I was beginning, I met Abe, and it's like he's still with us. What did Abe teach you about the watch trade? I mean, because he was one of the first true dealers, and this is a generation before the rise of the Italian dealers, which we'll talk about soon. He was just the pure New York watch dealer. Yeah. Tell us about Abe.
Well, he was amazing. I would listen to him on the phone because he used to run ads for buying watches. And people would call him and he would ask them, what does it do anything other than tell time? And I would listen to all the questions, and they were really quite, interesting. Then I would listen to him talking to his watchmaker. The big dealers of the moment were either Swiss, such as Mannheimer, or the Germans. The Germans were very big. I think there were something like 4 German auction houses that sold just watches at that point.
So in the 1980s, and for our younger listeners, this might be shocking, there were tiny classified ads that watch dealers would place in order to treasure hunt for watches.
Yeah.
So Abe would place an ad in the New York Times saying, we buy watches.
Yeah.
And with a phone number. And that's, I love it.
Yeah, isn't that crazy? I never really thought about it, but yeah.
That's the form of communication that works.
I honestly think he also placed ads in the Penny Saver, but I can't completely confirm that, but I'm pretty sure he did. I mean, he was in Great Neck, so why not?
Of course. You also mentioned Kevin Tierney. Kevin, I mean, is an institution. And have you been in contact with Kevin recently?
I see Kevin all the time. Kevin still works at Sotheby's as a consultant, but he's there about 3 to 4 days a week. He's like, for me, the next level. Abe knew everything about watches, but Kevin knew everything about everything else. I used to call Kevin the Shell Answer Man. If you remember, there was a commercial where they called the guy at Shell the Shell Answer Man, and you could ask him any question, and he would know the answer. And Kevin is kind of the same. He's the same. I mean, he knows so much about the decorative arts and all sorts of unusual information that you really just can't read in a book, or rather you could, but it's just so much easier to learn from Kevin.
I remember working with you, there were so many times we would come across a watch, maybe an escapement, and have a question. And the answer?
Ask Kevin.
Was ask Kevin.
I still do that to this day.
And we would march at that point at Sotheby's downstairs to the silver department, which was, I mean, I'll never forget the smell of the silver polish. It was a bit strong, to say the least.
Yes.
And then you'd walk back, and Kevin would be sitting there, usually with a loop of some sort, or that visor on his head. Mm-hmm. And we would ask Kevin, and that's how people learn in auction. There are incredible mentors, and I was really amazed by his breadth of knowledge, and I didn't know anything. And he always had the answer. So
I tell you, he really does, right? He still does. He's still a fountain of information. And this is before the internet, so we didn't have Wikipedia to go to.
It's true. And can you discuss the silver department and its connection to the pocket watch, the growth of pocket watches, and then ultimately wristwatches? Kind of a little history lesson of how wristwatch auctions began.
Basically, the connection was that Kevin was the head of several different areas. So, as I said, objects of virtue, miniatures, silver being the most important, and watches. And they're all sort of metalwork things other than the miniatures, of course. I think they even had chess sets at one point under him, but I don't think we sell those anymore. So I started in June of 1980, and we were actually having a sale that week, I think. Then Kevin informed me that he'd be going off on his annual summer holiday, which would be for a month. So I would be on my own. I wasn't completely on my own, but the only watch person there. There were maybe 8 people in the silver department at that point, but they were doing different areas they were experts in. So I was sort of anxietized by this. He already had me going out to see clients. And I said, well, what happens if somebody brings a wristwatch? Do I just tell them to go away? I mean, what do I do? And he said, no, well, it depends on the watch. There's this rumor that the Swiss are going to destroy all the mechanical equipment because this was at the height of the Japanese, or rather the Swiss quartz crisis. So, there's been something happening there. And with that, we were off to the races.
That is such a historical moment. You're the first person, I think, actually defined, at least from the auction side of the story, the moment that there was an awareness that wristwatch collecting was going to become a thing.
Yeah.
And that was with Kevin. I love it.
Yes, it was. I always tell that story because it's just right there in my memory. I mean, my God, it's almost like it was yesterday. And it wasn't yesterday.
And that dovetails nicely with the story of the Italians. So there was awareness of mechanical wristwatches might have a supply problem. There's definitely a demand problem, too.
Right. Well, that was the issue.
So where did the Italians come into the picture? Or when did the Italians come into the picture?
I mean, there were Italians in the picture from the 70s, I would say. People like Auro Montanari or Alessandro Frattini. Those guys, they go way back. They might have started with pocket watches, possibly, because everybody seemed to have. And then they got interested in wristwatches.
I've heard people say that swatches helped ignite that early collecting. Do you buy into that story?
No. Sorry. I mean, we were already having mania. I mean, in 1989, that was the year that Antiquarium had the Patek Philippe sale. By then, we were already selling watches for $100,000, which was extraordinary.
Oh, so that's interesting. So you're, even in the mid-'80s, wristwatch collecting was up and running. And
yeah, I mean, look, it was in its infancy.
Yes.
I mean, we were still trying to figure it all out, which watches are saleable. I mean, in those days, I think people were more inclusive of lots of different brands, although I guess today they are too, but not in terms of vintage. Vintage is kind of, the big guys. You're not looking at Movado polyplans as a collectible necessarily, like you would have in those days.
And bubblebacks in particular.
Oh, gosh.
Rolex bubblebacks were insanely collected during that period of time.
Yeah, that was a whole Japanese thing.
Yes.
Japanese were really into Rolex, but bubblebacks in particular.
There were some very important collectors that were quite active in the 1980s. The first that comes to mind is no other than Andy Warhol. And he passed away in 1987. Yeah. And Daryn, you had the chance to get to know Andy Warhol and talk watches with him. Can you share some of those stories?
Well, I had to help him a couple of times, but I certainly did get to meet him. I had to take him down to property pickup once. That was fun.
What happened?
He and I looked at each other, because it was the usual. It was kind of a little bit slow that day, service-wise.
I see.
So he was buying something, but he would be certainly one of the first Americans that got big into wristwatches, collecting-wise. And if you were out and about on a Saturday or Sunday morning at the flea markets in New York, you would see him everywhere. I say he's one of the earliest collectors, I think, for America of wristwatches.
Where did his watches go after he bought them?
he kind of bought them and then never moved them. When we went into the house unfortunately, after he passed away and we were given the go-ahead to do the auction, it was remarkable because he had things that he bought that he never even unwrapped, which, was crazy. And I don't really think that he looked at the things that he bought. There was a second stash of watches that was discovered after the main auctions in 1988, and it was a week of auctions, which was crazy because the celebrities that were there, it was really amazing. They found this other stash of watches and jewelry in a canopy bed, just on top of the canopy.
So he threw them on top of his bed, well, at least the canopy of the bed.
Yeah.
That is extraordinary.
And there were some really good watches in there.
He had fun with the hunt to buy the watches, but that was it. That was the act of purchasing.
And that was it it looked like, for a lot of collecting categories he had.
Well, it's tough to top Andy Warhol as a celebrity. But there any other notable figures earlier in your career that you met?
I didn't meet them, but I was in their house, which were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. That was really exciting. We were given the go-ahead that we were going to be selling the contents of the house in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. And I was asked to go in to look at the watches. And Mr. Al-Fayed had bought so much in 1986 from the first sale we had of the Duchess of Windsor. He actually made the house into a museum, basically. And everything, as best as possible, was left as it was when they lived there. So I remember picking up a watch that was his bedside watch. Don't ask me what it was. I don't remember. But it was just an amazing moment to be in a house like that of people that were so famous.
In the auction worlds, you're often put in positions where you're confronting history firsthand, where you're literally walking into time capsules. And it sounds like one of those amazing auction moments.
That was the same with Andy Warhol's house. It happens all the time with us. Maybe less at the moment, but certainly still happens.
But what's so incredible is that you're like the first responder of the objects. Sadly, after someone is no longer with us, you see these pieces kind of in situ, and clocks in particular really come to mind. And I could think of collections I looked at with you. The Schnipper collection, which was just such an exceptional collection of clocks.
Yes.
And they were left where they were left, where they were for so many years. And it is...
I know. And he moved to Rockford, if you recall, to be near the Time Museum. And then the Time Museum closed. And if you recall, we were having lunch with him the day we got the call that the Time Museum was closing. And the craziest part is that when Justice Shepro passed away, he was in a car accident, which he was coming back from the city of Chicago from a meeting with the city about hopefully them raising the funds to buy the Time Museum.
Oh, it's so heartbreaking.
Yeah.
In these catalogs that now for decades you've put together and written, these are historical documents of these various collections. Do you sometimes just take an old catalog and go through it? And what do you look for? What do you think when you go through these older catalogs?
I'll say, that was a good sale. You always think that afterwards, or you might think it was a bad sale. But when you're in the thick of it, you're so close to it, you don't realize if it's good, bad, or indifferent. But certainly with single owner sales, the one catalog I regret is the first Time Museum sale in 1986, which was the first group of pieces that were deaccessioned. And it was kind of, black and white, and it was not what the 1999 and later became. But then again, Sotheby's didn't do it that way at that time,
It's true. But that catalog, December 2nd, 1999, the masterpiece of the Time Museum, many say it's one of the finest auction catalogs ever made. It was an extraordinary hardcover volume of I mean, objects that we'll just never see again.
Yeah.
I mean, every piece was a museum piece, literally.
74 pieces, and I think we sold, it was 34 million, I think, or 28 million.
And then everyone talks about the Graves
Yeah.
today, but the other pieces that were there,
The Sympathique.
the Sympathique, which is at the Patek Philippe Museum today.
Mm-hmm.
Many pieces did go on to museums, I'm happy to say.
Yes, yes.
But some have actually recirculated. Have some of those pieces come back to auction?
Oh, yeah. We recently completed a series of sales called Masterworks of Time. Was a single-owner collection of 800 pieces. He was a big buyer of things from the Time Museum, especially in the 1986 sale. And I remember when I was doing first evaluation, I'm like, oh, yes, there's another old friend. That's what we like to call them when we come across pieces that we've sold before. It was really extraordinary to have the opportunity to sell them again and to be able to further contextualize the pieces and where they were in history, because now you know so much more about them, and it just always makes it so much more interesting. But what do I look for? I look for things that that we have and that I might remember a similar one, so I can compare, see what we said about it then. But to be honest, I think that the catalogs have grown a lot since the very early days.
You were, and I think credit is due here, I haven't thought about this, you're one of the first creators of an auction house database. In the sense, remember how you would have me cut catalogs?
Oh, but I can't take credit for that.
Who deserves credit for that?
Tina Millard. That's what she did. And actually, I shouldn't even say that. I mean, she was one who was my opposite number in London. She used to call me that. I used to love it. Oh, Daryn, my opposite number in New York. But anyway, she certainly did that. But also a lot of other departments did that. Silver did it. Jewelry did it. A lot of departments did it because in those days there was no formal kind of database. And we would literally have it categorized by, if with pocket watches, it would be either by century or what they did or by maker if it was somebody who was prolific. But that was always very helpful. Now we've digitized them, believe it or not.
That was my following question. But just for our listeners to visualize this, there were file folders of cutout pictures from the catalogs. Then it would have the name of the consignor and the name of the buyer done in ink. And then the sale price. I think it was always the hammer price that was written. So you could go through the files and you'll find 1518 and then all of the 1518s sold by Sotheby's. But with all of the, essentially the blockchain, the history of the buyers and sellers going back for decades. Now, we take this for granted because we all go to Invaluable or Live Auctioneers or any of the auction house databases to look this up. But this was being done by the auction houses in the 80s, and now it sounds like even earlier.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure it was being done in the 70s and the 60s, for that matter.
It's such precious information because this is where people started to compare and contrast saying, 1518s, like all of a sudden this is a division from a long signature to a short signature in 1948.
Yeah.
And you could compare, and this is where series started to come out in various Patek Philippe references.
Yes.
So all that scholarship started with you in a way.
Well, I mean,
not just you, but the community.
But no, it was a learning curve because you have to remember there were no books on wristwatches at that time. Mm-hmm. The first book on wristwatches was, I think it was Armbåndaren by Pfeiffer Belly, Gisbert Brunner, and that came out in 1986. In 1986, we were already, chugging along at that point. And then the Patek Philippe book came out around the same time, and then the Baraka book came out a little, maybe not more than a year or two later, and that was really an eye-opener as well. I mean, think about it. For years, we didn't even have books to refer to. Forget the internet. We had no books even.
That must have been very eye-opening to see the Huber and Banbury books for the first time.
Oh, yeah, that was so exciting.
So much information that was shared on production dates and archive pictures that people have never seen before.
It was Pandora's box.
And first
of
there
treasures.
was the pocket watch book, and then I think.
Well, they did have some wristwatches in the pocket watch book.
And then when the wristwatch book came out, there was just so much to see. Did those books change the marketplace?
I think they did. For me, what was the turning point was in 1989, especially Patek. In 1989, they came out with their limited editions to celebrate the Jubilee anniversary. And, that was the beginning of people would reserve them and then they would get sold out, sort of sold out as in out from under. Mm-hmm. Because there were a few different limited series at the time. And I remember people, they were waiting to get their officier or their jump hour, and they would be like really angry because they told them they were getting it, and then the guy sold it to somebody else because he got more money. And that was the beginning of seeing the retail price was not the resale price, but in this sense, the resale price was a lot higher.
I think of 1989 as such a pivotal year for Patek Philippe, but I've never thought about something that you just stated so eloquently. That is when retail and resale numbers separated.
Yes.
Within the world of Patek Philippe. So before 89, that just wasn't in the vocabulary.
No, I don't think so. They were making the 3448 was the only perpetual until they discontinued that. Before that, and then went on to the 3970, but before the 3448 and the 3450, which were essentially the same watch, just a little bit different, there was the 2499, and before that there was the 1518. Today, you have an army of perpetual calendars by them. There's a greater variety. They stepped up their game. I remember that it used to be if you had never heard of a Patek, then you couldn't afford one. That was kind of the thought.
That could be a new tagline.
Yeah, really. Because everybody knew Rolex. As I used to say, even the person that's very poor and living on the street knows what a Rolex is. But at the time, I don't think everybody knew what a Patek was. It's
been such a shift since 89 in so many ways.
And certainly the Caliber 89 certainly escalated that as well.
Did you go to any of the events in Geneva in 89?
I went to the sale. It was really exciting. We actually showed our own watches that were going to be coming up a month later at the Beau Rivage. But the sale was at the Four Seasons, which was called the De Berg only at that time. It was really everybody who was anybody went to that sale. It was just amazing.
And in 1989, what was your position at Sotheby's?
In 1989, I think I was already a vice president.
Okay. So at that point, you were building the watch department from something that was very small to a powerhouse. In the 1990s, you built Sotheby's watch department into an international powerhouse. You had so many experiences as you traveled around the world, from Hong Kong to Switzerland, and I think every country in between you visited. What was it like traveling during that period, and what was your day like in a pre-digital era? I would say.
Well, always quite exciting. You spent an awful lot of time on the phone. Your day, by the time you got home, you had no voice left. Because I was sort of a one-man band, I think I had just an administrator in the early days, not even a cataloger. We never left the building because we had a catalog, get the watches, authenticate the watches, and then catalog and then sell the watches. It was only in the 90s that we actually were given permission to hire a cataloger. And only in, say, 2000 that we became a four-man department. And today, each of our departments are between 8 and 10 people, which is, probably still kind of small, but still quite big.
This period of time was also a time that you spent a lot of time with Seth Atwood. Or you were very aware of what Seth was doing throughout these years.
Oh, yeah.
I'd love to hear some of your personal experiences from the Time Museum and with Seth in particular.
Well, I remember the first time he brought out the Graves for us to personally examine, and that was in 1986. And I was there with Kevin. That was the first time that they were deaccessioning things. He said, well, what would you put on that? And we were kind of, oh my God, is he going to really think of selling this? I mean, I remember we were kind of, flustered. And then we said, well, I guess 1 to 2 million. I mean, there'd never been an estimate on a watch at that point at 1 to 2 million.
And you were connected through your daily life with some of the greatest horologists to have ever lived. And that brings up Dr. George Daniels. I have a million questions about Dr. Daniels, but please just share some stories.
I met him, I think, probably within the first couple of months that I was at Sotheby's, because he would come over quite frequently to do lectures, or I'm not really sure. But it was either in his capacity at Sotheby's or not in his capacity at Sotheby's.
And what was his role at Sotheby's?
He was a consultant. We'd show him everything that we didn't understand. He was entree into many amazing collections. He would sort of do the talking while we did the work.
I got it.
But I remember, again, and I go back to 1986, because we had him come out to Rockford with us. The Time Museum, for people that don't know, was a very interesting place. It was in the ground floor, that's being polite, of a hotel or motor lodge called the Clock Tower Inn, which I now understand has been bulldozed.
Yes.
Which that's so sad. In this Clock Tower Inn, there was this museum, which literally was Mecca for horologists. And you would stay there when you would go there, because there was nowhere else to stay, and this was very convenient. In any event, I still remember him taking his morning walks. I would see him walking around, because the pool was glassed in. I just remember that so vividly. And then that he had to have his lamb chops every night for dinner. In fact, as I had remarked previously, I had my first gin and tonic. I met him. I went to his home in 1981 in that summer, because I was working in the London office. Tina Miller was mentoring me, and she sent me down to visit George. And that was just amazing, just sitting in the garden having gin and tonic. The first wine tasting I ever went to, that was George. And that was in Geneva. And he, try this one, try that one. And he was, he was such a character. And one of my favorite stories is during the 1986 sale again. I remember there was a father-son duo, actually, Luke von Kauvenberg and his dad. Mm-hmm. And they called me over to ask me about a watch that was in the sale. And they said, we think that this watch is recased. And that was a crazy exhibition. People literally just sat there for 3 days. And they would get there on time. They didn't want to give up their spot. I remember we practically were turning people away if we thought that they were not aficionados, shall we say, if they were just looking for like that spontaneous watch. We said, we're sorry, this is a private exhibition, because we couldn't handle the volume.
Too many people.
And also the intensity with which they looked at things. And it's interesting because that did foreshadow the rest of my career, I think. But I bring that up because, okay, so the Van Kauvenbergs were like saying, well, what do you think about this case? And I remember I was really in an agitated state at that point. And I went running over to George and I said, George, the Van Kauvenbergs think this is recased. And George would pick it up, turn it over, look at it, and he'd say, well, then tell them not to buy it.
What a great story.
I love that.
And that's one you could always remember at auction. It's like no one's forcing you to raise that paddle at the end of the day.
And I remember running back to them to say, George says don't buy it if you don't like it.
And their jaws must have just dropped.
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so. This is Daryn Schnipper, and you're listening to Collectability with John Reardon.
I don't want to get philosophical, but I'm going to try. Because I think a lot of people today are talking about how they're recognizing women's role in the watch industry as if it's a new thing. And it's not.
No.
And I think of, in the auction industry in particular, Tina Miller
Oh, yeah.
as being a trailblazer.
Absolutely.
And I think of you being a trailblazer.
Oh.
In the watch auction world specifically, there are two women who really led the charge building this industry globally. Would you share some thoughts about how things have changed over the years and how you leaned on colleagues from around the world, in particular Tina? Love some Tina stories of how you're able to build this machinery that's keeping the watch auctionery moving to this day.
Well, certainly, I think Tina taught me a lot, especially about watches and cataloging them and the way you look at them. And she was just so chic and classic.
And she recently passed away.
Yes,
for our listeners.
may her memory be a blessing.
Absolutely.
She passed away 2 years ago, I think it is now.
When did she start at Sotheby's?
She must have started at some point in the 60s, and she started as a secretary in the watch department, and then she worked her way up.
And she was close friends with George.
Oh, yeah, they were
forever.
thick as thieves. Absolutely. You know, she would take him on valuations. I remember the summer that I went to spend a few weeks in London, I actually stayed at her flat, and for part of it, she went with George to Venice to do a valuation in Venice. And I thought, wow, that's cool.
It's I'll never forget, you gave me the opportunity to work in London for a few weeks. This is in the 90s at some point.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in a room with Tina Miller and Dr. George Daniels.
Oh, wow.
Talking horology. And of course, Michael Turner. I mean, these are some of the greatest minds. And I just remember learning.
Yeah.
And listening. And I remember that, like, John, you're being awfully quiet. And I was like, 'cause I'm just trying to soak this all in.
Yeah, really.
Because
yeah.
in the auction world, we're put in positions. We're not even going back to history, but we're actually living history.
Yes.
In many situations.
Well, I never realized that until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, when people started to get more interested in what I had to say. And I realized, I mean, I lived through the whole George selling the coaxial escapement movement, because every time we'd be in Geneva and George would be with us, Tina would sort of preemptively warn us if he was going to be in a bad mood, because he came back from this watchmaker or that watchmaker who don't mind George. He's in a filthy mood today. And he would tell us, you know, how his day went and how he just didn't understand why those watchmakers couldn't get the coaxial to work, because he got it to work fine. And in 1999, finally, he did triumph with Omega purchasing the coaxial, and that was really exciting. I read his autobiography not too long ago, and it was just crazy because I lived through so much of that. And I think that's when it really crystallized for me that I had lived through all these chapters. I mean, wristwatches weren't even being collected, or two pocket watch dealers saying and collectors saying, well, the wristwatch can't last, kind of like they did when they first introduced the wristwatch to begin with at the early part of the 20th century. They can't last. And here we are.
I think every year you've probably been asked, is this the high point? The tides go up and tides go down.
Absolutely.
I remember how Frank Mueller, when I was cataloging for you, I gave special attention to Frank Mueller because they were the hottest thing out there.
They were. That's
going
the beginning.
Over retail. And it's amazing to think how some things come and go, and there are many things that stay. And of course, I'm a big fan of Patek Philippe, as you are too.
Yes.
And it's just extraordinary to me. Year after year, we keep seeing such price points, such records being broken.
I know.
And
well, yeah, with the Graves, of course, we did get the opportunity to sell it a second time. And the estimate was a bit higher, but it was actually kind of what he paid for it, the client, the first time.
In current dollars.
Yeah, because the currency had switched so much. But despite that, we still got record price for it all with the buyer's premium, $24 million. And that was just insane. We thought 11 was crazy. And it still remains the most expensive pocket watch in the world.
That is very important.
It is. And it was sold at a regular auction.
Just a non-charity auction.
Yes, exactly.
We should underline.
Exactly.
Now, could be a sensitive topic, but it's the question that's on a lot of our minds. You have truly mentored a generation of auction house specialists, many that have left the industry and many of which that are still in the industry, present company included. I would love for you to share some stories of your colleagues, past and present, that you have particularly mentored and taught. And I mentioned early on, like Arthur Chang, who was the head of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
He was such an amazing specialist in the 90s in Hong Kong. And
yes, he knew so much about modern Patek. We were just starting to learn about what he already knew because Hong Kong was such a hub.
It was truly foreign at that point because we were so focused on vintage. And here in Hong Kong, it's just an obsession of watches that were in current production. We take it for granted today, but this was a big deal in the late 90s.
Well, because again, where you would have Patek making 1 minute repeater, all of a sudden they had the 5016, the 5013, and to name those. And then there were others, the 5078, and we can go on and on. But with vintage, if you found a Patek Philippe minute repeating wristwatch, it's a big deal and still a big deal because they're so rare. Whereas I remember my colleague Tim Bourne going to Thailand for the first time. And he called me and said, oh, my God, you've got to come here. Everybody has a 5016 or a 5013. And it was remarkable, the clients we saw. I'm very proud of all those guys. And most of them, I would say, are still in the watch business, the majority. And it's a funny place to be on the outside watching them. But, it's a thing of pride, I think, that I could have that kind of impact on people.
So many individuals in this industry, they owe their careers to you. And I don't want to name, you could name as many names as you'd like. You could name as many names as you'd like, but I don't want to go through the list. But it is basically everyone in the industry, heads of departments and auction houses in the horological world. Almost all of them at one point learned from you.
Yes.
And in private conversations, they all speak so fondly of what you've taught them. And it always comes down to hard work. As I said in the opening statements, your commitment to getting the job done for the buyer and the seller, I think sets the benchmark for this industry.
It's very kind. I think that a lot of times people don't understand that when you're representing the seller, a lot of times it's their only piece. And, you have to do the best you can for them. I got you started, John.
It's true. Yeah.
Because I remember when you were done with your internship and you came to me through Dana Blackwell, a very wonderful gentleman. And I remember at the end of the summer, I said, what are you going to do now? And you told me that your plan was to join the Peace Corps or Work for America, one of those.
The Peace Corps, heading to Africa.
Right, heading to Africa.
To Malawi, of all places.
Malawi, oh my God. And I said, I can't even believe I said this, but I said, what do you want to do that for?
Oh, and you set me on my path. Thanks.
I mean, here, it's a terrible thing. I turned you away from doing good in the world.
I tried. But thanks to you, my life has been very dedicated to Patek Philippe.
I know.
Ever since.
Yes.
I was thinking in the auction world, and I still think it exists today, performance reviews. And I was thinking it's this time of year where you have to sit down with your boss and read your reviews. And Daryn, I recently found the performance review you gave me in 1997.
Uh-oh.
So I have to show you a copy.
I have to see that.
I had a lot to work on back then, and I have a lot to work on now. Yes, but you specifically said,
yeah. Oh, God.
I cannot spend too much time with the people with Walthams or Waltham watches. Because I was so guilty of that. Someone would come out with a $100 pocket watch, and I'd spend an hour with them. But you taught me eyes on the prize. Eyes on the prize. NSV is the term.
Yes.
No sale value. Next. And that's one of the toughest parts of an auction job is every day is unscripted, and you have to choose. You're always playing the long game and the short game at the same time. Long-term relationships matter, but also it's very cutthroat to get that watch that's in front of you if you want it.
Yeah.
And I think you found the balance of doing both, and that is not an easy balance to find.
Well, I think I learned it from people like Kevin Tierney, from Tina Miller, and another colleague called Elspeth van Tetz, who was Dutch, who was working at Sotheby's when I first was working there. And I remember we went on a visit, and there was a colleague there who was a Judaica expert. I mean, she was doing silver, I was doing watches, he was doing Judaica. And she was listening to him as the clients would come in, and he would say, Tel Aviv Airport, 1965, like he practically kicked them out. And I remember her telling him, now you have to be polite. They don't have, this is like an heirloom for them, and you have to put it in such a way that you're not going to burst their bubbles. And that's so true.
It is. It's an art form. And ultimately, it is a people's business.
It's so sensitive. It is so sensitive when people ask you for a price. Even when they come in and they have an appointment, you have to really be diplomatic. Not
an easy task. But the auction world does have its share of drama. So I'm waiting for the screenplay of your miniseries, because it'd be really good. It would be.
You mean like the owner of the Graves dying the night before the sale?
Oh.
That was horrible.
That must have been.
Yeah.
All right, take us back to that moment. What happened?
Well, first of all, I was so sad because he was a really nice guy, and he was way too young to have died. And it was all very sudden. And I remember feeling like he didn't really want to sell the watch, but he needed to raise a certain amount of money. And in fact, we had sold another tranche of watches for him in order to head off his not having to sell the Graves in the June of 2014, the titanium collection. Anyway, it was sad, and then it was very frightening because, we pulled out all the stops. What was going to happen? Was our contract good enough? Then you get to the commercial side. And we were fine. The way the contracts were written, and there was never even a thought to withdraw it. But I do remember one dealer coming up to me after the news, of course, got out. And he said, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? People think you're going to have to withdraw it. You're going to have to make an announcement. And we were like, we weren't making an announcement. We're selling it. If you ask, we're selling it. And we did. And I remember at the end, it was very satisfying. But at the same point, I was so sad about it because he wasn't there to see it and he didn't want to sell it to begin with. On another hand, what was great was by that point, we had sold Pete Fullerton's collection in 2012, and we had inherited all of Pete's documents. And in it, we found all sorts of documents that related to the Graves, including the famous picture where he had the Graves, Pete Fullerton, and the watches he had inherited from grandfather, as he always referred to him. But what it meant was when we did have the second chance of selling the Graves, we had plenty to say about it. Things like instructions for how to handle the watch from Patek Philippe or admonishments of what you shouldn't do because apparently somebody did break it at the beginning. And also we knew Pete Fullerton. We had lunch with him, and then weren't you there with me when we collected the watches?
Yeah, I remember that like it was yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. And he had died like the week before. They called me immediately and said that he had put me in the will to be the one to deal with the watches. And I never realized I had that effect.
And these things happen so quickly.
Yeah. Well, and they specifically wanted to get the watches out of the house because they were in the house.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yes. Pete Fullerton.
Yeah.
Remember him fondly.
Yep.
He, and like you said, the way he spoke about grandfather.
Henry
Graves Jr.
They don't make them like that anymore.
This is true.
And the funniest stories, of course, and I don't know if you remember them, but when we were at the Time Museum and Seth Atwood would wax on about how he bought the Graves, and then we'd be having lunch with Pete, and he'd wax on how he sold the Graves to Seth. And basically their stories were totally complimentary. A lot of martini lunches, as I recall.
That's always the answer. That's fantastic.
Apparently, yeah.
What has working in this industry taught you about human nature?
Oh, gosh. I think you always have to keep a healthy amount of skepticism. You can't believe everything you're told by any means. Plenty of, what do they call it now? Alternative facts.
Yeah, fake news, too.
Yeah, fake news in the industry. But I try to stay, above that kind of gossip. I mean, everybody likes a little gossip, but I try to stay away from that. Also, don't judge a book by its cover. I remember the first time I had a client who looked like he didn't have two sticks to rub together, and he ends up buying half the sale. So, those are very valuable selling lessons in addition to just life lessons.
I keep coming back to the theme of highs and lows because every day in the auction world is an adventure. Mm-hmm. Probably 100 interesting things happen today that you can't share, right?
Right.
With potential, because you're always like working for the next sale. And you just completed a sale week series. Congratulations. And now on to the next. It just does not stop.
No,
the
I'm already working on the next.
Keeps on turning. It must be, 40-something years you've been with Sotheby's.
Yes.
Right now. You just brought up something that's very interesting. There is a lot of gossip in the auction world at all times. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're all talking about watches, but in the auction world, dealers and collectors and auction house insiders are all like, who's going where next? And there's always whispers. Half of it is not true. Half of it often is true.
Half of it is true.
But one thing, you've always been above the gossip. So I commend you for that. You get the loyalty award from Sotheby's because you've been with them now since 1980, and that's so extraordinary. It says a lot about your character.
Well, for these days it is. When I joined Sotheby's, it was not extraordinary. And beside myself, but Kevin Tierney has been there since the 60s, and Tina joined in the 60s. I mean, a lot of the people that were my mentors were at Sotheby's for that length of time, and some of them, are still at Sotheby's. So it seems the watch world, though, seems to do a lot of jumping around, and probably because perhaps there's more possibilities to jump around, I guess.
Like the new generation of specialists, even because I'm an outsider now, but I still very engaged with all of the houses. It's a different way of working and a different way of thinking. When I was there, I really thought it was like a teamwork. It was all about teamwork and wasn't much about the individual. Of course, it was a job, but it was more than that. It was about auction house A versus auction house B versus C. And now I just think that there's a lot of people, a lot of specialists might be thinking about themselves more than the team. Is that fair?
Well, I think that the industry has made it be that way, but we do strive to work as a team, of course. But it is a little bit different now because you have things like significant contribution where you have to sell, bring in a certain amount. And I think that has certainly added a different level to things. But you can have several people be involved and get the credit.
My favorite part about the auction world are there's all these acronyms like KCM, CTL. Basically, it's like who's your client list, and when people move from auction house to auction house,
that's the first thing.
There's always like, so you literally fight over who your clients are, and it is such a nightmare. And I could just imagine your client list is locked because you've been taking care of some of these clients for decades.
Well,
now.
You'd be surprised. I mean, even I had to share. The point is, at the upper levels, there's only so many clients.
Yes, it's true.
And everybody comes with a relationship with them. And if they have a better relationship, or if we deem that they might be better suited for that person, then we go with that. But I'm always the one they come back to. I'm always the one that's there.
I remember at another auction house that was not Sotheby's, we would have to like state our case of how close we were to the client and justify our friendships, relationships.
Oh, I can
and then you would be arguing with another person who's doing the same thing to determine who is closest to that client that would have, I don't want to call it control, but have that relationship continue with the client. It's crazy because then if you were not on that list and then that client calls you and asks you advice, you're not supposed to talk to them.
Oh, well.
It's really awkward very quickly.
We're not quite at that level. I mean, it's important, though, when my colleagues do that we all share so that, and we do.
At the same time, I think collectors might have changed a bit over the years. There are some new trends that I'm seeing and we'll make it about Patek Philippe collectors. I mean, the trend for like sports watch madness or mania over the past few years is an extreme example. Have you seen any trends in the Patek Philippe world of what collectors are looking for and how they purchase at auction?
Well, it depends if they're at the beginning or toward the end. I mean, not the end, but I mean, if they've been doing it for a long time,
Let's talk about the beginning collectors, the early collectors.
Yeah, I think the beginning collectors are far more excited in a way because the world's their oyster. They haven't bought everything yet. It's a whole new world for them, and every day Patek is making new watches. It's also, where do the independent makers fit in, which they play a huge role today.
That's true.
In capturing the imaginations and pocketbooks of collectors. It's just much more dynamic and constantly changing, and the trends change, from season to season in a way.
I think that every day for you is a treasure hunt.
Yes.
There has to be the one grail that you have not found yet. Is there a particular Patek Philippe that you are on the hunt for, something that you haven't seen?
Well, I suppose it would have to be the other Graves.
Ah, the mystery watch.
The mystery watch, yeah.
I know where the box is.
Me too. We sold it.
I bought it.
Oh, okay. I can come visit it. You'll have to bring it to show me. I can spend some time with it and talk to it.
Just have to find out what went inside.
Yeah.
Do you have any theories?
I don't think it was actually made. I don't know. How could it just disappear like that?
It's a mystery.
Do you have any theories?
Pete Fullerton said over and over again.
Don't talk about it.
And he'd say the watch does not exist.
Right.
And he was very careful with his words saying the watch does not exist.
Yeah, it's true. He did.
Yeah, I have some
It's
theories,
weird for them to have a box and a certificate. He must have made it.
It has to exist.
Maybe it got stolen.
I don't know, but I hope it resurfaces. Maybe
know.
we'll see it at Sotheby's soon. That's for sure. Wow, Daryn. I think we could talk for a few hours reminiscing about past colleagues, past amazing auction house discoveries, the adventures, the highs and lows. But alas, we only have so much time.
I know. All good things must come to an end. Tempus fugit.
Of course, that's a very appropriate way to wrap up this discussion. But I want to thank you so much for your time, for your... You're just absolutely, you're an inspiration to so many people in this industry. And I wish our listeners could see the face that she's making. It is absolutely true that Daryn has inspired collectors and other auction house specialists, administrators, catalogers, and the list goes on to embrace this world of watches, which is an insane, crazy world.
Completely insane, crazy.
And I hope these few minutes that you've joined us today that people can listen to Daryn's stories and me reminisce a bit too, because it's very emotional for me to speak
well,
to
this
you.
is very emotional for me. I mean, it's like, how do you discuss your life in 1 hour?
That's true. This is your life. I dream, and may this be many, many years from now, of a roast, the Daryn Schnipper roast, where everyone who's ever worked with you comes together.
Oh my God, that would be embarrassing.
The stories that would be told
would be hilarious.
It would be great. So the Netflix options are being sold just as we're sharing these words, because that would be a best-selling episode.
That would be funny.
I don't know if many of our listeners realize the impact that you have personally had on this industry. At one particular time, the heads of all of the watch departments of the auction houses were all formally reported to you at Sotheby's. So you were almost the farm team of the entire industry. Absolutely love it.
Well, John, I can't thank you enough. This has been so lovely to spend this time and to, talk about watches and where they were and where they've gone and where they're going.
Thank you, Daryn. And I wish you a happy new year, as this will be released right at the end of this month, end of December. And I want to thank our guests, and I want to thank our listeners so much for joining us today on our 21st podcast in the Collectability series. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so that you do not miss any future episodes. This is John Reardon for Collectability.